if you deal with ponds at all and you don't have it yet, I'm going to talk just about a few references that are handy to keep around. First is this Ohio Pond Management Handbook. It's free from any Division of Wildlife office, or you can download it. It's a really good general overview on managing ponds. It doesn't really go into great detail on any one topic, but it touches pretty much on every topic you can imagine, at least. So it's a good place to start looking for information. Then if you need information, because I've got more slides than time, I'm not going to read this in great detail, but know that you can find me, and I occasionally write an article that's relevant to the season on hand. Specific to aquatic plants, there are a couple of resources you should be aware of. There's the Aquatic Plant Management Society. It's a national professional organization, and they are really good about posting updates, keeping track of news. If there are new herbicides in the works or recently approved, this is a good place for information. To network with fellow professionals who deal with aquatic plants, I recommend that you look to this branch of the Aquatic Plant Management Society, the Midwest Aquatic Plant Management Society. So just resources that you should be aware of and exploit if you ever deal with aquatic plants. Regarding identification, there's this great site that I refer to, aquaplant.tamu.edu, right? And of course, TAMU stands for Texas A&M University. It's a function of their extension program. It's in essence kind of an encyclopedia of aquatic plants. Now, it's not very thorough. It really only addresses the very common things, but you're only likely to see the very common things. Also, they're in Texas, so they use some funny words for stuff that I probably wouldn't use. And they're a lot farther south than we are, so they've probably got some plants that are nuisances down there that we'll never see up here. However, if you're aware of those shortcomings, it's still a very valuable site. If you can identify a plant using their catalog of images, every plant is associated with a page that gives you management options that describes everything that has been shown to be effective on managing that plant. Herbicides, biological functions like grass carp, etc. But it's not always that fast to update, right? So if a new herbicide hits the market, it might take years before it actually hits the site. So once again, use it, but know it's got some shortcomings, use it with a little bit of savvy, and drop me a line if you need some help. Then, of course, I'm referring here to our classic fact sheet on the bottom line that was eliminated from availability when we rebranded everything, but I've, of course, kept electronic copies. I share them with you at will, so if you want an electronic copy of that, I'm going to be referring to this fact sheet quite a bit today. And much of the data that I'm presenting today is a deliberate effort to update this fact sheet. So I'm going to update all those tables with the new herbicides. You'll see that presented here today. You've got it in your book. Again, ask questions if you got them. Let's talk a little bit about an outline of the presentation today. So we'll first talk about new approvals of aquatic herbicides and why that's relatively rare. We'll give an overview of aquatic herbicides and highlight some newly approved chemicals. And then we'll touch just a little bit on some news. So first off, new approvals of aquatic herbicides. Since this program began through about the 1980s, up to 2000, there were a total of only 7 chemicals labeled for aquatic application. Only 7. That's not a lot. But then since the 2000, that number has more than doubled, right? And why? But still, it's a very, very small number compared to those chemicals that are available for application in the landscape. So why is that? And it's really an issue of scale. When you think about crop applications, we're often talking about multiple applications over the course of a year, and we're talking about 175 million U.S. acres of corn and soy production alone in the U.S. at an estimated value of many billions of dollars. That's hard to actually get a good handle on because the data are so diffuse. Aquatic applications, in contrast, are limited, often only once a year, often only spot applications to a small body of water, so you're not even treating the entire body of water, very limited. Of course, the registration process requires a tremendous number of environmental and health tests. It takes about 8 to 10 years on average to get a product fully registered, which results in an about $40 to $60 million expense in creating a new product for the market. Okay, so we've got this combination of a really small market very high registration costs for new products, limited time for patent protection. The result is rather limited expected return from newly approved aquatic products, which results in a very small market that's dominated by just a couple companies that specialize in that niche. So let's talk about those products. But first, before treating, let's talk a little bit about a contrast. When we're talking about crops, we're usually talking about, a monoculture, or if we're talking about turf, maybe a few species that we want to leave standing, and everything else is a weed, and we want it gone. So we've got these resistant plants developed, and our target is everything else. So we blanket with rather non-selective things to kill everything in the landscape, leaving our monocultures standing. In contrast, when we're talking about treating the water, we're usually talking about a small handful of undesirable things that we want to selectively remove to leave quality habitat and use for the water for other things. So once again, a huge difference in scale. When we talk about ponds, of course, ponds are ponds because they're full of water, and we do stuff with that water. Those ponds have a tremendous diversity of intended functions. So before you put an herbicide in the water or make any management decision regarding what you do with a pond, you have to consider that pond's intended functions. So let's give a gross generalization about those functions. When we're talking about ponds in Ohio, almost always we're talking about a human-made system that's intensively managed. It is not a natural system. A lot of people want to behave like Lake Superior, right? You're half an acre in a yard and surrounded by turf is not going to function like Lake Superior. So we've got this intensively managed human-made system. Even if the best management option contrasts a little bit with nature, don't be afraid to take that management option if it's going to best sustain the use of that pond into the future. Site's primary function, and in some cases like stormwater ponds, may or must trump other uses, right? So consider the pond's primary function first. A stormwater pond might not have the kind of habit to produce a good fishery. It's got to be that stormwater pond first, then other stuff that you might be able to add because of the site's size or whatever is gravy. If the presence of aquatic vegetation actually helps serve that pond's function, tolerate the presence of aquatic vegetation. The right coverage will benefit water quality, but what is right is for your client or you, if it's your own pond, to determine. If you've got a big site, of course, you've got a little bit of liberty in order to make different management decisions for diverse habitat, right? So you can maybe manage a swimming beach here and manage a fishery over there. And if you're dealing with a site that is owned or managed by multiple stakeholders, like a homeowners association, you need to realize some compromise in order to recognize the expectations of each user, of each legitimate user in that site. Before you put an herbicide in the water, you need to identify the plant correctly, because not every herbicide is perfectly effective on every plant. And when we're talking about aquatic plants, most references are going to start by referring to the growth form. Okay, so the emergent plants are going to be most like treating terrestrial vegetation. Okay, these are the plants that are standing with their roots in shallow water or along the shoreline with rigid stems that stand up into the air. Things like cattails, grasses, sedges. These are the emergent plants. Moving out a little bit into the water, we've got the rooted floating leaf plants, the things like the water lilies that put roots into relatively shallow sediment and send a leaf up to the surface to float. Moving out a little bit deeper, we've got the submerged species. Of course, these are wholly or mostly underwater, and they've got flaccid stems, so if you were to pull that plant up and bring it onto the shoreline, it would just collapse. It wouldn't be able to stand upright. Free-floating things are things like the mosquito ferns. The biggest nuisance we have regarding free-floating plants is probably going to be the duckweeds and water meals. And the algae is just that amorphous green goo that you might find in all kinds of different forms. It's really broadly diverse. Algae is kind of a generic term for stuff that's kind of green and almost a plant, but not quite yet. That said, there are some references, like this aquaplant site, that lump floating leaf things together with emergence. So just be aware that that happens out there. If you're looking for a water lily, you might not find a category for the rooted floating leaf things. You might have to look for the emergent species. Of course, not everybody's perfectly adept at identifying aquatic plants. So if a client comes to you with a plant that you can't identify, look to those references I've recommended, or as a last resort, of course, you're always welcome to contact me. If you want to get me a specimen of an aquatic plant, my favorite medium for receiving that specimen is highly detailed digital photographs, because I cannot smell digital photographs, right? So if it's summer and hot and you really need to get a physical specimen to me, make sure it starts really cold and moves really fast. Because if I receive a sack of black decomposing goo, I'm probably not going to be able to identify it. I'm probably not going to be very happy about it either. So let's talk about this classic fact sheet. Many of you have probably referred to it in the past. I certainly do. Here I've got a comprehensive table of every herbicide that's been approved for application to the water within Ohio and coincidentally within the US right now. I'm not going to go in great detail over the whole thing because many of these products are old and you will have familiarized yourself with them over time, but I will tell you how this table works. First off, if you see that asterisk, okay, that's a new chemical that is not detailed in that old fact sheet. In the first column, we've got chemical names, not brand names, only chemical names. Then, of course, absorption, whether it's contact or systemic. In the water, contact herbicides are very often good for spot treatment if you can get thorough coverage of the plant that is, of the spot, of the area that's to be treated. Relatively fast acting, of course. Systemic herbicides come into their own if you've got to treat something like a cattail that has a very substantial root system and stores a lot of energy and regenerates multiple times from a contact application. If I call something broad, it's probably pretty good at killing lots of different aquatic things. And if I call it selective, it's probably a little bit better at killing just a few aquatic things. Then when you put an herbicide in the water, that water is going to be associated with use restrictions before a particular use can begin. And those use restrictions are almost always on the label going to be categorized, right? So if I've called something minimal, it probably has very, very short or no waiting periods for use of that water to follow, or touches on very, very few different restriction categories. If I've called it extensive, it probably touches on lots of use categories or has an extremely long waiting period, sometimes more than a year, or you might have to test that water before a particular use can resume and find a very low concentration of product, sometimes less than 1 part per billion, before that water use can resume. Okay, so very general terms. Of course, you know this. If you need the detail, you're going to get it from the label. But here I've summarized this in very general terms for you as a way to start looking. Here is the list of all of the contact herbicides approved for application to the water. Again, I'll just give you the quick format of how this works. Here in bold, we've got the chemical name. In parentheses to follow, if the patent has expired in particular, I've got an example of a few common brand names that are available. And then following the colon in very general terms, what is good at killing, right? So if, again, if you need detail, get it from the label, but this is a good summary to start. Regarding contact herbicides, every year I get a call from some old guy or 7 who says, hey man, where can I get me some of that Carmex? That stuff is great, that kills everything. Sure, it does. It kills all the trees around your pond. It might kill your dog too. Don't put Carmex in the water. Carmex has no business being in the water. Then systemic herbicides, same format. In bold, we've got the chemical name, parentheses to follow, examples of brand names that are common and available, and following the colon, what they're good at killing in very general terms. So have a quick look. If you've got any questions, do ask them, but know that I'm going to move on to the new herbicides pretty quickly. Off we go. So this is the table that was presented in that original fact sheet. I don't expect anybody to be able to read it, which is too bad because I will be quizzing you afterwards. Just kidding. Of course, up here, again, we've got the chemical names of the herbicides. Down here, we've got the types of plants that are common to the area and categorized by growth form. What I really want you to see from this is how this table is formatted, right? So if a product intersects a plant with an X, you can expect that product to kill that plant. If a product intersects a plant with a P, you're only likely to get a partial kill of that plant, okay? So here's the format. These are all of the old products, and now let's move on to the new. So first we have the new products as applied to emergent plants. Same format. Have a quick look. I'm going to go into detail on each of these new products soon. Yeah. It depends. I'm actually quite involved in that, and I actually have 2 slides on that very thing. So we'll get to that real soon. And it was the Department of Agriculture, but working with a committee I chaired to advise the ODNR as well to generate that list. So, yep, I was really involved in that, and as such, you're going to hear about it because I'm very proud of my own labors. Here we have the same table for floating leaf plants. Once again, chemicals up top. Plants along the first column, and you will note I've also, for these tables, I have omitted those things that are not present in Ohio because otherwise it gets even more cluttered than it already is. Know that you've got this in your book, quick digestion. Let me know if you've got any questions. Otherwise, we're moving on in the interest of time. Here we have the submerged species, and you can see quite a few of submerged species. There's a little bit of ambiguity in that Tepramazone lists pondweeds, Potamogeton species, and all pondweeds used to be in the genus Potamogeton, but some of them have been split out. So here I've got a speculative X under specific species name because it's not really named. And then I've got a question mark for those Potamogetons that are no longer Potamogetons, but our pondweeds have been split from there. So, you know, you've got to have a little bit of plant savvy to understand the table, but once again, drop me a line if you've got questions. Here's a table for use restrictions. Now, when I was first contacted about giving this talk, I was asked to give a little bit of attention to ponds that were used for irrigation purposes. So regarding those irrigation purposes, I've highlighted common agricultural uses of pond water. For this particular table, note that the first column will have the chemical, and then we've got categories of use restrictions listed across the top. And obviously, wherever they intersect, that is the use restriction associated with that. It's in your handout, it's in the old fact sheet. Quick moment to digest that. I'm not going to dwell on that because I'm really excited to get to the new products. So here's the same table for those new products, okay? I have bolded those agricultural and irrigation uses for the new products. For the new products, note that there is very, very little restriction on how those products impact human recreational interests, fishing, drawing domestic water, very little impairment of those human uses. You'll note this last one for Tepramazone, it lists none for applications. It gives a specific concentration below which there is no restriction, but that concentration is the maximum permitted by the label, right? So long as you're following the label, there is functionally no restriction, including on Tepramazone for those categories. However, for use in irrigation in particular, some of these products are very, very restrictive. And we'll talk about the new products in detail soon. So a quick look, if this table generates any questions, feel free to ask them. Otherwise, just refer to it in your packet. Very brief word to livestock, okay? Because a very common use of pond water is to water your cattle or even your chickens, right? Even if watering livestock has no label restrictions, even if it's deemed safe, very often the smell of the chemical shortly after applied will put an animal on an individual basis off of drinking that water. Okay, so you might have to do a little bit of experimentation. Be aware that some animals just won't like to drink funky smelling chemical water. So Clipper. Clipper is a very broadly effective contact herbicide. You'll need an adjuvant or surfactant for application to floating leaves or emergent things in the air, not so much if you're injecting it into the water. Don't apply it to flowing water. Note that there is a restriction on irrigation. And Clipper, well, Flumioxazin, there's a brand new brand labeled for aquatic applications as well called Pond Clear, but I've not seen actually Pond Clear available yet. I just know it's listed as available on the web. I've not seen anybody actually applying it. So this is a new product. The patent protection is just now expiring. New products are beginning, additional products are beginning to appear. So there will be a little bit of competition driving down the cost. This was an expensive product, but it's really interesting in that it is far and away the most effective thing on duckweeds that can be a serious nuisance, and it's about the only thing that's been shown to be effective on related plants called watermeal. Carfentrazone ethyl, very broad effectiveness on a number of different things. You'll need to use an adjuvant or surfactant with this. Restrictions based upon application rates to follow, so there are varying application rates depending on what you're treating. Regarding watering livestock and irrigation, note that there's very short time duration because this product leaves effective concentration very quickly, but a bit longer for watering, especially turf, but also ornamentals and food crops. Bispyribac is an effective systemic for a select list of things, including as an alternative for hydrilla, which is a recently encroaching invasive plant, very aggressive, something I don't want to see in Ohio's waters. Should only be considered an alternative for hydrilla, though. The go-to for hydrilla remains floridone, but hydrilla has developed resistance to floridone in one population in Florida, so they're trying to mix up treatments of hydrilla if you happen to have to deal with hydrilla. And you probably won't unless you're very near to Cleveland or in the far southeast corner of the state. Adjuvant or surfactant, again, for essentially dry applications on plant material that's exposed to the air. Watering livestock is very restrictive for this product, as well as for irrigation of crops. How many of you deal with crayfish farms? Fantastic. Don't put it on your crayfish farm. ProcellaCORT. Now, ProcellaCORT is a new product that really surprised me. They started the evaluation process in 2014 or even early 2015. I can't recall the exact date, but it's already hit the market just this year. So it was really, really moved quickly. And the reason it was moved quickly is because it has almost no toxicity on animals. And it is extremely, extremely selective for water milfoils. Okay, now we have some very rare endangered water milfoils in Ohio, rare to the point that I've never seen the rare ones in the wild. But Eurasian water milfoil is one of the biggest nuisances we have. You are not to permit livestock to drink treated water, in essence, because their crap then becomes toxic compost. So there are extreme restrictions on applying this product to broadleaf crops. You don't want it to contact broadleaf crops in any way, very toxic to them, including if your cows poop on them. Penoxsulam has come into its own, especially on exposed mud flats. So this is a product that if you've got a stand of nuisance vegetation, you can drain the pond, expose the mud flat. Penoxsulam is a product that really comes into its own. And finally, let's touch on just a little bit of news, and that is the new invasive plant rule. Okay, so the Division of Plant Health within the Department of Agriculture has the authority to do this. They initially named 38 plant species, 15 of which are aquatic, and they have a mechanism in place by a panel of experts to advise them on adding new plants. Okay, so if you deal with people who are, for example, working in the water garden industry and producing plants, these plants are no longer permitted to trade hands in any way. Okay, and in one case, the purple loosestrife, this is a noxious weed that has to be removed from right-of-ways. Now, in September of this year, a committee that I advise also provided a list of another 19 species in collaboration with the Ohio Invasive Plant Council, aquatic species to be added. I'm not listing them here because I don't know what the state's decision will be, but know that there is the intention to add another 19 aquatic species to this list. And I'm a fisheries biologist. There's little I like less than talking about killing plants with herbicides, but I am ready to take your questions. Because I'm a fisheries biologist, the real purpose of this slide is I like to look at pictures of myself with fish. And that's where you can find me, but I'm easy to find, so I'm going back there. Yeah. So the biggest problem with excessive treatment is going to be killing. If you kill off too much of an area, you stop photosynthesis, and as those plants are decomposing, they're also consuming oxygen, and you're risking an oxygen crash. And so not only with copper, but with any product. So if you're following label recommendations with copper, copper will only be toxic to algae, not the fish directly. But if you kill too much algae, you will cause an oxygen crash and fish kill. So a general rule of thumb, with some variability listed on product labels, is when the water becomes warm, you don't want to do whole water treatments, and you're usually only going to be treating a quarter to a third of the area at a time, and usually spanning those treatments out 2 to 3 weeks with some variability listed on the label. That's mostly to avoid causing an oxygen crash, okay? But with some variability, and I'm really butting up on time, so if you want to ask more questions, I think I've got time for one more question by that clock, do I not? Also, I have another appointment, but I'll be here until 10:30, so grab me in the hallway if you want to talk a little bit more. Yeah. So when you find those extremely restrictive concentration use restrictions, almost always there will be discussion on the label regarding labs with whom you can work to get those tests done. Yes, indeed. Right. So, I mean, that in essence kind of puts the kibosh on using those in production facilities. Right. So when the recreational use is a little less restrictive in a lot of those, yeah, that's a difficult thing to deal with. That's why they're listed as extensive use restrictions on my table. Yes. Real quick question. A lot of the products are kind of common. You can find them in the rural cages and tractor supplies. But your experience on some of these other products, as far as direct and clientele to e-stores and eBay and places like that, your experience or recommendations? So a lot of the like the Rural King stores or tractor supply, they often only deal in a specific company, right? So they will get that company's version, and that company might not make all of those. I will often refer customers to the web to purchase these products with the caveat that they've got to adhere to that label, of course, because that label is